There is a man you probably know. You may not know his name, but you know his face. You have seen him at the dinner table, at the construction site, maybe at the end of a long hallway in a house that used to be full of noise and is now very quiet. He is the man who has been through things. Real things. The kind of things that do not make it into conversation, because talking about them wouldn't change a single second of what happened, and because the man who carries them has decided, somewhere along the way, that what he carries is his and no one else needs to see the weight. He survived something. He endured something. He lost something that never fully came back. And yet every morning he gets up, puts on his boots, and goes back into the world with a kind of quiet dignity that most people in this era have completely forgotten how to recognize. This video is for that man. If that man is you, you have found exactly the right place. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful human being on earth. He ruled an empire of 60 million people. He commanded armies. He held the lives of entire nations in the palm of one hand. He could have done anything, built monuments to his own name, surrounded himself with every luxury the ancient world could manufacture, spent his days in the soft comfort of absolute power. He chose none of that. Instead, he kept a private journal. He wrote to himself in the dark, in the middle of wars and plagues and betrayals, and he argued with himself on those pages with a ferocity and an honesty that is still, 2,000 years later, almost shocking to read. He was not writing for historians. He was not writing for posterity. He was writing because he understood something that most human beings never stop long enough to understand, that the only war that actually matters is the one happening inside you. And he intended to win it. What Marcus Aurelius was building, in those private pages, in the silence before the court arrived, in the discipline of a life examined daily and without mercy, was not an empire. Empires fall. He knew that. What he was building was character. The kind of character that holds when everything around it is collapsing. The kind of character that does not require good circumstances to function, does not require an audience to persist, does not require the approval of the world to know its own worth. 8 principles shaped everything he did. 8 principles that, if you genuinely understand them and apply them, will change the way you move through the world. Not in one dramatic moment. Quietly. The way all real change happens. One day at a time, in the hours no one records. If you have been looking for something real, something built for the man who is done with noise and ready to do the actual work, then subscribe to the Stoic Edge right now and stay with us. Because what we are building here is exactly that. Principle 1. Guard your silence like gold. There is a particular kind of power that the modern world has forgotten entirely. It is not the power of the loudest voice in the room, or the most eloquent argument, or the fastest response. It is the power of the man who holds his silence deliberately, who speaks only when he has something worth saying, and who understands that every word he does not say is a word that cannot be used against him, cannot be misread, cannot betray what he is thinking before he has decided what to do about it. Marcus Aurelius possessed this power in a degree that his contemporaries found remarkable, and sometimes unsettling. He was not a quiet man because he was cold or indifferent. He was quiet because he had decided, through years of discipline and deliberate practice, that silence was one of the most powerful tools available to a human being, and he refused to waste it. The man who speaks first in a conflict has almost always already lost. Not because speaking first is always wrong, but because the man who speaks first has revealed himself. He has shown what bothers him, what he wants, what he fears, how much the situation has already gotten under his skin. The man who waits, who absorbs, who observes, who lets the silence hang until the other person fills it, holds an advantage that no amount of eloquence can match. He knows more. He has given away less. And when he finally speaks, every word lands with a precision that the first man's words never could, because they were chosen rather than discharged. Marcus trained himself to wait. He trained himself to watch. He trained himself to let things come to him rather than reaching for them. In an empire perpetually in crisis, perpetually full of people who wanted something from him, this discipline was not a luxury. It was survival. Consider the moment when Marcus received word that Avidius Cassius, one of his most trusted generals, had declared himself emperor and was marching to claim the throne. The court erupted. Advisors demanded immediate and overwhelming military force. Men who had served him for decades called for public execution, for the destruction of everything Cassius had built. Marcus went quiet. He thought. He wrote. And then, rather than unleashing the destructive power of the imperial military on a man who had served Rome faithfully for years, he wrote letters calling for restraint. He asked the Senate not to execute the senators who had sided with Cassius. He expressed, in writing, his genuine hope that the situation could end without further bloodshed. Cassius was killed by his own officers before Marcus ever reached him, and Marcus reportedly said he was sorry, because now he would never get the chance to forgive him publicly. Let no one in this generation tell you that is weakness. That is a level of self-possession that most human beings will never come close to achieving. That is the man who, at the moment of maximum provocation, at the moment when he had every justification in the world for fury, chose silence and then chose grace. That is what the discipline of silence actually looks like when it is backed by genuine strength rather than performed restraint. 2,000 years later, we are still talking about it. Because character expressed in silence echoes longer than anything said in noise. In your own life, this principle operates everywhere. It operates in the argument where you say the thing you cannot take back. It operates in the meeting where you offer your frustration before you have thought through what you actually want to happen. It operates in the text message sent at midnight that you regret by morning. It operates in every moment where the gap between feeling something and saying something collapses completely, where there is no space at all between the impulse and the response. That gap is the battlefield. Everything you are trying to build lives or dies in that gap. The discipline of silence asks you to sit with discomfort rather than discharge it through speech. It asks you to watch other people say things that are wrong and say nothing, not because you have surrendered, but because you understand that correcting them in that moment will cost more than it gains. It asks you to let people underestimate you without rushing to prove them wrong. It asks you to let your work speak while your mouth stays closed. It asks you to stop explaining yourself, stop defending yourself, stop broadcasting your victories or your pain, and to live with the simple, powerful knowledge of what you have done and who you are, without requiring anyone else to confirm it for you. That is not small. That is one of the rarest forms of freedom available to a human being in this world. Marcus wrote, in the Meditations, that he had learned from his grandfather the practice of speaking little about his own experiences and never boasting of them. Not as false modesty, not as performed humility. As the recognition that a man's character is not built in the telling of his story but in the living of it. That the man who talks constantly about how hard he works is usually doing the least of it. That the man who advertises his suffering has decided that his suffering is the most important thing about him. That the man who broadcasts every victory needs the victory to be seen, because without the audience, it doesn't feel real. Marcus wanted nothing to do with any of that. He wanted to be real whether or not anyone was watching. And he built that realness, day by day, in silence. For the next 7 days, track honestly every time you speak in order to be seen rather than to communicate something genuinely useful. Every story you add to not because it matters but because it makes you look better. Every opinion you volunteer not because you have thought carefully about the question but because you want people to know you have opinions. Every immediate response in a conversation where waiting would have produced something better. Track it without judgment. Just notice. Most people discover that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of what they say on any given day serves no purpose except the management of how they appear to others. Marcus called this wasted motion. He spent a lifetime eliminating it. And every word he didn't say became one more brick in a wall of character that stood for 20 centuries without crumbling. Guard your silence like gold. Because in a world that is drowning in noise, the man who knows when to be quiet is the most powerful man in any room he enters. Principle 2: Think before you react. There is a particular kind of suffering that almost no one names directly, because naming it requires admitting to a weakness most people would rather pretend they don't have. It is the suffering that lives in the cold aftermath of a reaction. Not a decision, a reaction. The moment after the raised voice. The slammed door. The cutting remark that found its exact target. The email sent in fury that you could not unsend. The silence that follows, when the heat has drained out of you and you are left standing in the wreckage of something that took years to build and 20 seconds to damage. You know what this is. Every person above a certain age has been in that wreckage. The question Marcus Aurelius asked himself, the question he returned to hundreds of times in the Meditations, was not how to stop feeling things. It was how to put something between the feeling and the action. How to think before he reacted. The Stoics had a technical understanding of this. The first moment of feeling something, they called the impression, the raw, unfiltered arrival of experience before any thought has been applied to it. The impression is automatic. It is physiological. It arrives before you have any choice about receiving it. Your boss says something dismissive in a meeting and your body floods with the chemistry of threat before your rational mind has registered a single word. Your partner says something that lands on a wound you have been carrying for 20 years and you are already responding before you have understood what just happened. This is not a character flaw. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting you, preparing you for action, erring on the side of threat because the cost of being wrong about danger is much lower than the cost of being wrong about safety. Marcus understood this mechanism. He wrote about it in the language of his time, the impression arriving faster than reason, the body prepared for battle before the mind has had its say. But the description is recognizable to any modern neuroscientist. And his response to this mechanism was not to fight it but to work alongside it. He did not tell himself to stop feeling angry. He told himself to feel the anger, and then pause before acting on it. He recognized that the first response of the body is automatic and entirely outside his control, and that the second response, the choice, is entirely within his control, but only if he builds the space to make it. The space does not arrive on its own. It must be constructed through deliberate, repeated practice, through the experience, over and over, of feeling the heat and holding still, until the holding still becomes as available as the heat once was automatic. What lives in that space, between the impression and the response, is your freedom. Not freedom in the abstract philosophical sense. The very practical freedom of not being controlled by what happens to you. Of not being the man whose entire day is ruined by one stranger's rudeness. Of not being the father whose children learn to manage his moods rather than trust his character. Of not being the husband who says the thing he doesn't mean and then spends weeks trying to recover the ground it cost him. In that space, however small it begins, you are not the sum of your reflexes. You are the sum of your choices. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a man who has lived by his life and a man who lives it. The practice Marcus used was simple in description and demanding in execution. When an impression arrived, when the heat of anger rose or the cold of fear settled or the pull of some desire made itself known, he would name it. Not indulge it, not fight it, not immediately act on it. He would observe it directly and say to himself, "This is an impression. This is a feeling. This is information arriving, and I am going to pause before I decide what it means." And then he would ask himself the question that appears, in different forms, across hundreds of entries in the Meditations: does this require my action right now? Is this thing I'm feeling pointing at something real, or is it pointing at a story I am telling about something real? Is the urgency I feel coming from the situation, or from my interpretation of the situation? And is that interpretation accurate? That last question is the one that does the most work. Because most of the time, when we react badly, when we say the damaging thing or make the decision we will spend years correcting, we are not reacting to what actually happened. We are reacting to what we believed was behind what happened. The dismissive comment from your boss is not just a comment, it is, in the story your mind is already writing, confirmation of the fear you have been carrying for years that you are not enough, that your contributions are invisible, that you could disappear tomorrow and no one would notice the absence. You are not reacting to the event. You are reacting to the accumulation of every similar event that came before it, magnified by every fear attached to what it might mean. The event is small. The story is enormous. And the reaction that destroys something is almost always a response to the story, not the event. The damage that reactive behavior does in long relationships, in marriages, in families, in friendships that have lasted decades, is one of the most underexamined forms of human loss available. Because in those relationships, the guard comes down in a way it never does with strangers. The man who manages himself perfectly well in every professional context can come home and be unrecognizable, faster to anger, harsher in judgment, less patient with the smallest things, because the people closest to him have, by virtue of their closeness, the ability to reach the places where the defenses are thinnest. And the tragedy is that the very relationships most worth protecting are the ones most exposed to the reactive damage that public behavior would never allow. Marcus dealt with this. He wrote about it in the context of court rather than family, but the dynamic is the same, that the men who got the best from him were the men who understood how to approach him when he was clear rather than when he was depleted. He admired that about them. And he held it as a standard for himself, to be the man who waited for his own calm before making decisions that mattered, rather than forcing decisions in the full heat of the moment demanding them. He failed at this. He says so. He came back to the standard the next day. And the day after that. Every day, back to the standard. The evening review, practiced daily, has a specific application here that is worth developing as a habit. Before you sleep, do not review your day in general. Ask one specific question: where today did I react when I should have chosen? Where did the gap close completely? Where was there no space at all between the impression and the response? And then ask the question that actually produces change: if I had the moment back, and I took the 30 seconds I didn't take, what would I have done differently? Not to punish yourself. To rehearse. The mind does not distinguish strongly between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. By rehearsing the better response after the fact, you are practicing it, building the neural pathway that will make the pause more available the next time the same heat arrives. Over months of this practice, something genuine changes. The gap begins to appear on its own. You start to feel the familiar heat of a specific trigger and notice, almost simultaneously, a small hesitation that didn't used to exist, a fraction of a second in which something in you recognizes: I know what this is. I have been here before. I know how this goes. And in that fraction of a second, the choice exists. Not always clearly. Not always comfortably. But it exists. And the man who has that fraction of a second is not the man who had it taken from him for the first 50 years of his life. He is the man who built it deliberately, in the dark, one day at a time, because he decided that his choices were worth more than his reflexes. That is the whole work. That is what Principle 2 asks of you. Principle 3, embrace the obstacle. Marcus Aurelius used a word that has no clean translation in English. Impedimentum, an obstacle, a hindrance, something standing in the way. He used it in a sentence that has become, across 20 centuries, one of the most quoted lines in all of philosophy: the obstacle is the way. Not around it. Not over it. Not something to be solved and forgotten. The obstacle is the way. The thing that is blocking your progress is, in Marcus's framework, the specific path through which your progress must travel. And when you understand what he actually meant by this, not as inspiration, not as a slogan on a coffee mug, but as a precise description of how reality works, it changes everything about what you are willing to do with difficulty. Marcus did not write this from comfort. He wrote it in the middle of the worst stretch of his reign, in the years of the Antonine Plague, which was killing his citizens by the hundreds of thousands. There is an internal obstacle that deserves its own attention, because it does more damage to more men than any external difficulty. It is the moment of honest reckoning, the moment when you look at the life you have been living and recognize that it does not match the life you intended. When you tally up the years and the choices and the things you traded away and the things you never started, and find yourself standing in a life that belongs to a performance of who you were supposed to be rather than to who you actually are. That is the obstacle that stops men cold. Not because it is insurmountable, but because crossing it requires a kind of honesty more threatening than any external difficulty, the honesty of admitting that the choices were yours, that the drift was allowed, and that the only way forward is through the admission rather than around it. Marcus faced this too. He wrote about the gap between the philosopher he wanted to be and the emperor he was required to be. He wrote about the way the demands of power pulled against the demands of character, about the moments when he looked at his own behavior and did not recognize it as consistent with his values. He did not use those moments as license for despair. He used them as the obstacle itself, as the specific, named difficulty that the next day's work was required to address. The recognition of your own distance from your own best self is not a reason to stop. It is the most important piece of information you will ever receive. It is the precise instruction for where the work needs to go. Every obstacle in your life right now is a doorway wearing the costume of a wall. The financial pressure. The marriage that has gone cold. The body that is sending messages you haven't wanted to receive. The grief that settled in years ago and never fully lifted. The version of yourself you have been meaning to become, and keep postponing for circumstances that are more convenient. Every single one of these is a doorway. Marcus walked through all of his. He did not come through them unchanged or unscathed. He came through them more deeply himself, with a character that had been tested against reality rather than only against theory. That is the only kind of character worth having. Subscribe to the Stoic Edge and stay with us, because we are going to spend a long time on this doorway together. Principle 4. Master your inner world. Marcus Aurelius called it the inner citadel. Imagine a fortress at the very center of a city, the most defensible position, the last structure standing when everything outside the walls has fallen. Now imagine that fortress is not made of stone but of thought, of attention, of the slow, deliberate, never-finished work of deciding what you choose to care about and how you choose to interpret what is happening to you. The Stoics called this the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the mind's capacity to observe itself and govern its own responses. Marcus believed, and argued across hundreds of pages of private writing, that this inner citadel was the one possession that could never be taken from you unless you surrendered it voluntarily. Not by emperors. Not by armies. Not by plague or poverty or loss. The body could be broken. The reputation could be destroyed overnight. The wealth could disappear in a season. But the governing mind, the inner citadel, remained inviolable as long as you were willing to defend it. This is a radical claim. Because most of us, most of the time, do not experience our inner world as a citadel. We experience it as a city that is perpetually being overrun. We wake at 3 in the morning and cannot stop the thoughts. We receive a piece of criticism and spend 3 days composing responses in our head to a conversation that is already over and will never be resumed. We watch someone else receive recognition for work we did and feel a jealousy we are ashamed of and cannot extinguish. We make a mistake and revisit it hundreds of times, long after any useful examination of it has ended. We are, in the plainest honest description, ruled far more by what happens to us than by any principle or intention we have consciously chosen. And most of us accept this as the permanent condition of having a mind rather than as a problem that can be addressed. Marcus refused that acceptance. He spent the entirety of the Meditations arguing against it, not with the confidence of a man who had solved the problem, but with the persistence of a man who had committed to fighting it for as long as he lived. He writes about mornings when he did not want to get up, when the warmth of the bed and the weight of everything waiting outside it conspired to hold him down, and he argues with himself, "You were not born for comfort, you were built for action, get up." He writes about the irritation he feels when people around him behave badly, and he reminds himself, "You knew when you woke up this morning that you would encounter people who are selfish, short-sighted, and difficult. This is not a surprise. The fact that you are irritated is not evidence of their failure, it is evidence of your own failure to manage your expectations." He writes about the fear of death and argues with it patiently, entry by entry, until he reaches not comfort exactly but a clear-eyed acceptance that the fear is serving no purpose and that he will not feed it any more of his attention. This is the inner citadel in construction. Not triumphant. Not peaceful. Active. Contested. Demanding. The entries in the Meditations are the daily battle reports of a man who has chosen to govern himself and who is discovering, over and over, how hard that is. He does not pretend otherwise. He does not dress up the failure as growth before the growth has actually happened. He names the failure, identifies it precisely, argues with the impulse that produced it, and renews his intention for the next day. That is the work. The same work, repeated, without a finishing line, for as long as the life continues. The quality of attention is the core of the inner citadel. Not intelligence. Not willpower. Attention. The capacity to be genuinely present in your own experience, to observe what is happening in you without being completely swept away by it, to notice the anger or the fear or the craving without immediately endorsing it as a command. The Stoics called this the observer, the part of the mind that can watch the rest of the mind from a slight distance. You cannot control what arrives. You cannot prevent the anger from rising or the fear from settling, or the loneliness from arriving in the quiet hours. What you can control, with practice, is whether you observe those things or whether you are those things. The man who is his anger has no choice about what it does. The man who observes his anger has every choice. That gap, between being and observing, is where the inner citadel is built. Marcus used the evening review as one of his primary tools. Before sleep, he would examine the day, not as a journal of events, not as a list of accomplishments, but as an audit of character. Where did I live up to my own standard today? Where did I fall short of it? What specific situation revealed a weakness that needs more work? He was not punishing himself. He was inspecting the craftsmanship of his own character with the honest eye of a craftsman who cares about the quality of what he is building. A craftsman who never inspects his work has no way to improve it. A man who never honestly examines his own behavior has no way to develop it. The evening review creates the feedback loop without which the inner citadel cannot be maintained, because the walls you do not inspect are the walls that quietly crumble. There is a specific form of inner work that the men in this audience need to hear named directly, because it is the one most consistently avoided. It is the work of sitting in silence with yourself and genuinely not liking what you find. Not the mild dissatisfaction of a man who wishes he were more disciplined or more successful. The deeper, more threatening discomfort of a man who, in genuine silence, discovers that there is a significant gap between the person he presents to the world and the person he actually is. That the confidence he performs is partly concealment. That the certainty he projects in certain areas is covering an uncertainty he has never examined. That some of the ways he has treated people, the small unkindnesses, the moments of impatience, the choices made for convenience that were dressed up as principle, were not what he tells himself they were. That work is the inner citadel's foundation. And it is available to anyone willing to stop moving long enough to begin it. Your inner world is the only territory you actually own. Everything outside it is rented. It can change without warning, be taken without permission, be altered beyond recognition by events you did not choose and cannot reverse. The quality of your attention, the integrity of your character, the honesty of your self-examination, the consistency of your values. These are yours as long as you are willing to maintain them. Marcus understood that the empire he ruled was, in an important sense, less real than the empire of his own mind. The Roman Empire fell, as all empires do. The man is still here, still teaching, still pointing at the one construction project that outlasts everything else. Start the work. Stay with it. The inner citadel is not built in a season. It is built in a life. Principle 5. Focus on what you control. There is a form of mental suffering so common, so woven into the ordinary texture of most lives, that it goes entirely unrecognized as suffering at all. It is the suffering that comes from directing your energy at things you cannot change. Lying awake rehearsing conversations that already happened and cannot be revised. Spending enormous amounts of emotional resources worrying about outcomes that have not arrived and may never arrive. Measuring your peace of mind against the behavior of other people who are not aware they are responsible for your peace of mind and would not accept that responsibility if they were. Making your happiness conditional on events that you do not have the power to determine. This is one of the oldest and most destructive habits available to human beings, and Marcus Aurelius, 2,000 years ago, named it with a precision that should shame us for not having corrected it by now. The foundational Stoic distinction is between what is up to us and what is not up to us. What is up to us, our judgments, our intentions, our efforts, the quality of our attention, the choices we make in response to what happens to us. What is not up to us, everything else. The outcome of our efforts. How other people respond to us. Whether we receive the recognition our work deserves. Whether our bodies stay healthy. Whether the people we love make good decisions. Whether we are treated fairly. Whether the world cooperates with our plans. The vast majority of everything that the average person's happiness depends on falls into the second category. And the average person spends the vast majority of their mental energy on that second category. The return on that investment is exactly what the math predicts: nothing. You cannot control what you cannot control, and pouring your attention into it produces only exhaustion and bitterness, with nothing built to show for it. Marcus saw this in himself, and in the people around him, and in the structure of power itself. He was the most powerful man on earth, and even he encountered, every single day, the absolute limits of what his power could change. He could not control the weather on a military campaign. He could not control whether the men he trusted would remain trustworthy. He could not control whether the plague spreading through his empire would slow or accelerate. He could not control his own body's deterioration. He had more practical power over more people and events than almost any person who has ever lived, and it was still a fraction of what he would have needed to determine the outcomes he cared about. And so he made a deliberate, daily, repeatedly renewed choice to put his energy in the only place where it would not be wasted: the quality of his own response to whatever the world sent. This is not resignation. This is the misunderstanding that causes people to dismiss Stoicism as passive or defeatist, the assumption that accepting what you cannot control means not caring about outcomes or not working toward them. That misunderstanding is the exact opposite of what Marcus practiced. He worked as hard as any emperor in Roman history. He cared enormously about results. The difference was that his sense of self, his capacity for peace, his fundamental stability, none of these were attached to the outcomes. They were attached to the effort, to the quality of the character he brought to the work, regardless of what the work produced. He could work with complete commitment and sleep at night even when the results did not go as planned, because his peace did not live in the results. It lived in the effort. And the effort was entirely his. The practical test of this principle is simple and demanding: examine your worry. Not in the abstract, but in the specific texture of your daily mental life. Take the things that keep you awake, the things that occupy your thoughts in the car, the things you rehearse and revisit and cannot set down. For each of them, ask a single question: is there an action I can take, right now or tomorrow morning, that would address this? If yes, take the action and stop worrying, because the worry is redundant to the action. If no, if the thing you are worrying about is genuinely outside your ability to change, then the worry is not just useless. It is harmful. It is consuming the resources you need for the things that actually are within your reach. Marcus called this the expenditure of energy on territory that does not belong to you. And a man who spends his life in that expenditure will arrive at the end having worked very hard and built nothing in the only place where building was ever possible. There is a specific application of this principle that matters enormously for men in the second half of life, and it is the one that is almost never spoken about directly. It is the question of what other people think of you. Of reputation. Most men above 50 have spent significant portions of their adult lives managing how they appear to others. At work, in the community, in the family, in the story their children will carry about who their father was. They have been shaped by this concern in ways that are often invisible to them. And what Marcus says about this, directly and repeatedly in the Meditations, is that your reputation is not up to you. It never was. What you say, how you behave, the choices you make in private and in public, those are yours. What other people make of them is completely outside your control. It was always outside your control. The man who has made genuine peace with this, who has stopped trying to manage perceptions and started simply being the person he wants to be, consistently and without performance, is living in a freedom that most people spend their entire lives working toward without ever finding, because they were looking for it in the wrong place. The work of this principle begins every morning with a list. Not a to-do list. A control list. Before the day begins, before the inbox opens and the demands arrive, write down what is actually within your reach today. Your effort. Your attention. Your honesty in the conversations ahead. Your consistency in the habits you have chosen. Your willingness to keep going when the results are not yet visible. That list. That territory. Live there. Everything outside it is weather. It may be pleasant or severe, but you did not create it, and you cannot change it. The only intelligent response to weather is to dress appropriately for it, and keep moving. Principle 6. Remember you will die. Marcus Aurelius thought about death more deliberately and more systematically than any emperor in Roman history, and he is remembered as one of the most vital, purposeful, productive men who ever held power. That is not a coincidence. The philosophy he practiced had at its center an ancient discipline called memento mori. Remember that you will die. Not as morbid preoccupation or rehearsal of despair. As a tool. The sharpest lens available for seeing your life clearly, for understanding what actually matters, for cutting through the endless manufactured urgencies of daily existence, and getting to the things that are genuinely real. Marcus believed, and argued across the pages of his private journal, that the man who has truly internalized his own mortality is the freest man alive. Because he is the man who knows what matters. And the man who knows what matters cannot be easily manipulated by the things that don't. The Meditations return to death constantly, from a dozen different angles. Marcus lists the names of emperors who believed their power was permanent, and notes that not one of their empires survived, that the names they worked so hard to carve into eternity are barely remembered by anyone walking the streets of Rome in his own day. He writes about the brevity of human life against the immensity of time, that even the longest human life is negligible against the span of history, and that the man who dies at 90 and the man who dies at 30 both vanish with equal completeness. He writes about looking at the great men and women of history and recognizing that they are entirely gone, not just dead, but dissolved, every trace of their specific consciousness inaccessible to anyone who comes after. He approaches his own death plainly, with what reads across 20 centuries as genuine calm, not performed stoicism, not the bravado of a man suppressing fear, but the settled orientation of a man who has thought about this until it no longer requires avoidance. What Marcus was afraid of was not death. It was dying badly, dying with diminished character, dying having wasted the time he was given, dying before he had said what needed to be said and been the person he kept intending to become. And the Stoic response to that particular fear is not reassurance. It is action. If you are afraid of dying before you have repaired the relationship, pick up the phone today. If you are afraid of dying before you have done the work you came to do, start today. If you are afraid of dying having never said to the person who most needed to hear it what they mean to you, say it today. The memento mori is not a comfort. It is a deadline. And like every deadline, it clarifies everything. Think about the men you know who have had a serious health crisis. A heart attack. A cancer diagnosis. A car accident that put them in hospital for a month and showed them, in an instant, exactly how easily the ordinary continuation of their life could be interrupted. Almost universally, those men describe the aftermath as a period of extraordinary clarity. Suddenly they knew exactly what mattered and what did not. The grudge that had been festering for 6 years revealed itself as an absurd waste of time. The career they had been grinding through in order to impress people they didn't even particularly like seemed, in the hospital bed, like a strange dream. The afternoon with the grandchild, the walk with the wife, the phone call to the old friend they had been too busy for, suddenly these things appeared in their proper size, enormous, irreplaceable, the things that everything else was supposed to be in service of. That clarity is what memento mori creates. Not through a crisis. Through a daily practice. Through choosing, every morning, to remember that this is real, this is temporary, and therefore this is precious. Marcus practiced this through a specific discipline. Each morning, He reminded himself that this day might be his last. Not as a source of dread, but as a source of focus. Not the fantasy answer to that question. I would quit everything and go somewhere beautiful. The honest answer. The answer of a man who has genuinely thought about what his life is for. Most men, when they answer that question honestly, do not describe anything exotic or dramatic. They describe being fully present with the people who matter most. They describe doing the work they believe in with their whole attention instead of the divided attention of a man who is doing it for appearances. They describe saying the honest thing rather than the comfortable thing. They describe being the person they have always intended to be, without further delay. Memento mori does not produce paralysis or despair in the man who practices it seriously. It produces the exact opposite, an intensification of presence, a clarification of priorities, and a liberation from the trivial anxieties that consume so much of an ordinary life. There is an application of this principle specifically for the men this channel speaks to, men who have reached the age where the question of legacy has become real. Marcus thought carefully about legacy, and his conclusion was austere: the desire to be remembered is just another form of vanity. The men you most admire from history cannot know that they are admired. Their consciousness, their individual experience of being alive, is completely inaccessible. The fact that their names persist is of no comfort to them. They do not know. Marcus's counsel was to redirect the question. Instead of asking how you will be remembered, ask how you are living today. The legacy that actually matters is not the story told at your funeral. It is the texture of the daily life you lived, the quality of your presence, the integrity of your character, the way the people closest to you felt when you were in the room. That legacy is being built right now. In how you speak to your wife tonight. In how you show up for the people who need you. In how you treat the person who can give you nothing in return. It is built in the moments no one records, and those moments are available to you today. Not eventually. Today. Remember that you will die. Not because it is a pleasant thought. Because it is the most clarifying thought available to a human being. Because it cuts through everything that doesn't matter and leaves everything that does in unmistakable relief. Because the man who carries this knowledge with him, not as dread, but as honest orientation, is the man who is never wasting his time, never performing a life that isn't his, never postponing the things that are genuinely important for the things that only seem urgent. That man is more alive than most people around him ever managed to be. Marcus lived that way. For 40 years, in the middle of everything that was required of him, he lived with this knowledge at his back. It did not diminish him. It made him more fully present in every moment he was given. It can do the same for you. Principle 7. Live by virtue, not validation. There is a moment that most men recognize, even if they have never spoken about it. It is the moment when they first understood, somewhere below the level of words, that the approval they had been working toward all their lives was not actually available. That it was not something that could be achieved and held. That no matter how much they accomplished, something more would always be required. That no matter how well they performed, there would always be someone to find it insufficient. That the audience they had been performing for, the parents who were hard to please, the peers who set the standard, the boss whose evaluation mattered, the partner who somehow never seemed fully satisfied, that audience had not, in all the years of sustained effort, become reliably satisfied. The performance had improved. The approval had not materialized in the way it was promised. And the man is left standing with a resume full of achievements and a strange, hollow feeling he is not sure how to name. Marcus called this trap by its right name, living for the opinion of others. He identified it as one of the primary sources of unnecessary human suffering, not because other people's opinions are irrelevant, but because making them the foundation of your sense of self is a form of slavery whose chains are invisible until you try to move against them. The man who needs your approval has given you an enormous power over him that you did not ask for and that he cannot afford to lose. His peace of mind is dependent on a supply he cannot control, cannot predict, and cannot maintain. Your opinion of him is not a measurement of his value. It is a reflection of everything going on inside you, filtered through whatever limited information you have about who he is. making that the organizing principle of a life is like building a house on a river. You can do it technically, but it will be swept away at the first flood. What Marcus proposed instead was living by virtue, by the specific Stoic understanding of 4 qualities of character that are entirely within your control and entirely your own. Wisdom, the ability to see clearly and reason honestly. Courage, the willingness to do what is right when it costs you something to do it. Justice, the commitment to treating every person with fairness and dignity, regardless of what they can offer you in return. Temperance, the discipline to govern your impulses and keep your desires in proportion. These 4 virtues were, in Marcus's framework, the only real goods. Not wealth. Not status. Not recognition. Not even health or longevity. Virtue. The quality of your character, expressed in action, in the moment when it costs something and no one is necessarily watching and no one may ever credit you for it. That is what he was building. That is what he believed was worth building. The validation trap is particularly dangerous because it is so normalized, so built into the architecture of the world most men grew up in, that it is almost impossible to see as a trap at all. The career progression that proves you are valuable. The house in the right neighborhood that demonstrates you have made it. The car that signals a certain kind of success. The social media presence that performs a version of you more polished and purposeful than the one sitting in silence at 6 in the morning wondering if any of it is real. These are not inherently wrong. But they become deeply wrong when the appearance of virtue replaces virtue itself. When being seen to be a good father replaces being genuinely present with your children. When being known as a hard worker replaces the inner satisfaction of work you actually believe in. When being respected in the community replaces genuine respect for yourself, grounded in the honest knowledge that you are living in alignment with what you actually value. Marcus struggled with this. He writes about it with unusual candor in the Meditations. The pull toward the approval of the court, the temptation to govern in ways that would be praised rather than in ways that were right, the seduction of a popularity that was always available to an emperor willing to give the people what they wanted rather than what they needed. He identifies this pull, names it, and then dismisses it, not easily, not once and for all, but repeatedly, in entry after entry, renewing the decision to hold virtue as the standard rather than validation. He concluded, eventually, that the only sustainable position was to root his sense of self so entirely in virtue that the opinions of the court, the cheers of the crowd, the criticisms of his enemies, and the flattery of his friends all passed through him without sticking. Not because he was indifferent to people. Because he was no longer dependent on them. And the man who does not need your approval is, paradoxically, in the best possible position to actually serve you, because he has nothing to protect. This principle carries a specific weight for men who grew up in an America that valued a certain kind of quiet reliability. Men who were taught, directly or by example, that worth was demonstrated through what you produced, what you provided, how solidly you stood when things got hard, how little you asked for in return. There was something genuinely stoic in that formation. But there was something missing from it too, the internal life. The private work of asking yourself what you actually believe, what you actually value, what a life that is genuinely yours looks like from the inside rather than the outside. The silence and the reliability those men practiced was sometimes genuine discipline. Sometimes it was avoidance, an inability to examine themselves that masqueraded as toughness, a refusal to be known that masqueraded as self-sufficiency. The Stoicism Marcus practiced demands both the external discipline and the internal honesty. The consistency and the self-examination. The reliability and the willingness to look, in private, at the gap between who you are performing and who you actually are, and to do the quiet, unglamorous, daily work of closing it. Not for anyone else. For yourself. For the version of you that looks back at you in those early morning hours of silence. That is the man who needs to be able to respect what he sees. Not the version of you that performs for the world. The real one. The only one that will be present at the end, when the performance is over and what remains is simply the life that was actually lived. Live by virtue. Not by validation. The world will take care of the rest. And the rest, as Marcus knew, matters far less than most people spend their lives believing. Principle 8. Build your morning, build your life. Marcus Aurelius began every day the same way, regardless of what the day would demand. Before the court arrived. Before the dispatches were read. Before the weight of empire settled on his shoulders in the way it settled every morning, reliably and without mercy. He would sit in silence with his thoughts. He would write. He would remind himself, not because he had forgotten, but because he understood something fundamental about the nature of the mind that most people in the modern era have not yet accepted, that principles do not maintain themselves. That values, left untended in the noise of an ordinary day, drift. That the mind defaults toward reactivity, toward distraction, toward the immediate and the stimulating rather than the important and the difficult. And that the only reliable defense against that drift is the deliberate, daily practice of reconnecting with what you have decided to be. This is why the morning is not a preliminary. It is not the waiting room before the real day begins. For Marcus, and for every man who has genuinely understood what Stoic philosophy is asking of him, the morning is the most important battlefield of the entire day. It is the moment before the world has made its claims. Before the inbox has installed its anxieties. Before the news has deposited its daily freight of outrage and alarm. Before the demands of other people have organized the hours around their urgency rather than your intention. It is the moment when you are closest to your own values, your own vision, your own honest understanding of what this day is supposed to accomplish, and who you have decided to be within it. What you do with that moment determines, with more precision than most people realize, what the entire day becomes. Marcus's morning practice had components that can be identified from the Meditations with reasonable confidence. He began with the premeditation of adversity, a deliberate, calm acknowledgement of the difficulties the day would bring. Not manufacturing anxiety about things that hadn't happened. Not cataloging disaster. A clear-eyed recognition that today, like every day, would contain people who were difficult, circumstances that were uncooperative, moments when his values would be tested by the friction of reality. He would name these things before the day began, not to dread them but to remove the element of surprise. The man who wakes up expecting the day to go smoothly is derailed when it doesn't. The man who has already acknowledged that difficulty is part of the structure of every day is meeting it as expected rather than as intrusion. The difference in emotional stability between these two men, across the span of a year, is enormous. There is a version of this morning practice that translates directly into the life of any man who takes it seriously. Before the phone is touched. Before any information from outside enters. Sit for whatever time is available, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, the full hour if your life allows it, and ask yourself 3 questions. What is actually within my control today? What difficulty is coming, and how do I want to respond when it arrives? And what is the one most important thing I need to do today? Not the most urgent thing, but the most important thing, the thing that most directly builds what I am actually trying to build. These 3 questions, answered honestly and without rush, create a compass that the events of the day cannot easily redirect. They install a direction. And the man who has a direction before the day's demands arrive is a fundamentally different man from the one who wakes up and immediately begins responding to whatever is most pressing. Marcus also used the mornings for the self-review of the day before. He came back each morning to what the previous day had revealed, where he had met his own standard and where he had fallen short of it, what specific failure had shown up and what specific virtue had been called for and found insufficient. He wrote about this practice with the honesty of a man who had decided that his own development mattered more than his own comfort. He did not allow himself to reframe yesterday's failure as a lesson before he had actually learned from it. He looked at it directly, named what it was, and then decided specifically what he intended to do differently today. Not in general. Specifically. That specificity is the difference between an examination that produces change and a review that produces only the temporary relief of having noticed without committing to anything. The relationship between the morning practice and the whole shape of a life is direct and compounding in a way that deserves to be stated plainly. The man who has a deliberate morning for 1 year has spent, at even 20 minutes a day, more than 100 hours in direct, uninterrupted contact with his own values and intentions. That contact is not theoretical. It is not the contact of reading about good values or listening to a video about them. It is the contact of sitting with them, arguing with them, renewing the commitment to them, applying them specifically to the situations of your actual life. Over a year, over 5 years, over a decade, this practice produces a man whose values are not abstract. They are present. They are the furniture of his inner life, familiar and immediately accessible regardless of what the day brings. When the crisis arrives, and it will arrive, he does not reach for his values and find them foreign and theoretical. He reaches for them and finds them immediately, because they have been there every morning for years. Give yourself the morning. Not perfectly. Not every morning without exception. But consistently, as a practice you return to rather than a rule you break. Guard the silence of it. Do not let it become the time when you check your phone, the time when you scroll before you think, the time when the day's noise arrives before you have had any contact with your own mind. Marcus protected the morning the way he would protect any position of strategic importance, because the ground you hold at the start determines what is possible for everything that follows. From the morning, you can see everything. Without it, you spend the entire day fighting uphill. The man who walks into his day from a deliberate morning is not the same man who stumbles into it half-formed and immediately reactive. He has already chosen who he is going to be. He has already identified what matters. He has already prepared for the difficulty coming. He carries an intention into the day rather than waiting for the day to tell him what to do. And that intention, renewed every morning, tested every day, examined every evening, is how life is built. Not in the grand moments. In the mornings. In the dailiness of it. In the quiet, unglamorous, irreplaceable work of a man who has decided that the most important construction project he will ever undertake is the one happening inside him. Marcus built his life in the mornings. You can too. But you have to start. Not eventually. Tomorrow morning. When quietly or not at all. There is a specific kind of man that the modern world does not know how to celebrate, because he refuses to make himself easy to see. He has built something real. Something constructed over years of honest effort, of failures absorbed and used, of consistent choices made in alignment with what he actually believes rather than what would look good to the people watching. He has paid the price in full. And he does not need anyone to know it. He is not hiding it. He is not ashamed of it. He simply does not require an audience for it to be real. He has built something, and he knows it is built, and the knowing is sufficient. He does not broadcast his victories. He does not perform his discipline. He does not manage his reputation the way a brand manages its image. He simply lives what he has built. Quietly. With a self-possession so complete that the people around him may not be able to name what it is, but they feel it. They feel the difference between a man who is performing and a man who simply is. This is the destination that all 8 principles are pointing toward. Not silence as strategy. Not the management of appearances. Not the careful construction of an image that is difficult to criticize. Genuine internal sufficiency, a life whose meaning and integrity are so fully grounded in the man's own values, so honestly and consistently maintained, that external acknowledgement becomes truly optional. Not occasionally optional. Genuinely, structurally optional. The man who has arrived at this place does not need to be seen to know his own worth. He does not need to be validated to trust his own judgment. He does not need to be celebrated to maintain his commitment. He is not above wanting these things. Marcus was not above wanting them. But his peace does not depend on receiving them. His foundation is elsewhere, somewhere that no one else can reach, somewhere that the weather of other people's opinions and the turning of external circumstances cannot penetrate. Think about what quiet winning actually looks like in a real life. It looks like the man who is up before his family every morning, doing the work that matters in the hours that belong to no one else. It looks like the father who is consistently and genuinely present at the table, not performing attentiveness, not going through the motions, but actually there, putting the phone in another room, asking real questions, listening to actual answers until the answer is finished. It looks like the husband who, after 30 years, is still choosing the marriage, not because it is always comfortable and not because he has no other options, but because he has decided that the deepest work of his life is happening in the house he comes home to and he is not walking away from it. It looks like the man who faces a serious health problem and processes his fear privately, with honesty, and then shows up for the people who need him without making them carry the additional weight of his falling apart. It looks like the man who does something genuinely good for someone who can give him nothing in return, and never mentions it. Not once. Marcus Aurelius was not a small man. He was one of the most consequential figures in the history of Western civilization, a man whose decisions shaped the world in ways that are still echoing. His military campaigns held the northern frontier of the empire. His legal reforms extended protections to the most vulnerable people in Roman society. His philosophical writing has influenced 2,000 years of human thought about what a good life looks like and how it is built. He was not quiet in the sense of being insignificant. He was quiet in the sense that his power came from within rather than from the noise around him. It was grounded in his own character, his own daily practice, his own honest assessment of himself, not in the approval of crowds or the fear of enemies, or the admiration of people who would not be born for 1,000 years. He was not performing strength. He was being it. And the difference between those two things is the whole of what we are talking about. The generation of men who built this country, the men who are the fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers of the people watching this video, were not quiet men in the sense of being passive. They were quiet in the sense of carrying their difficulty without broadcasting it, of showing up without requiring recognition, of providing without performing provision. There was something genuinely stoic in that way of being that deserves to be honored rather than dismissed as emotional unavailability. But Marcus would have pushed them further. He would have said, "The discipline is real and the consistency is admirable, but the work is not complete until it includes the interior, until it includes the honest self-examination, the deliberate building of the inner citadel, the willingness to look at the man behind the performance and ask whether that man is truly aligned with what he claims to value. Not for the audience. For yourself." That is the part of the work that the Stoic silence of that generation sometimes avoided. And it is the part that, when it is finally done, makes the quiet winning genuinely quiet, because there is nothing left to hide. The Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius demands both the external consistency and the internal honesty, the reliability and the self-examination, the quiet showing up and the genuine looking inward. The man who does both, who maintains his character in public and examines it in private, who holds himself accountable in the silence of his own conscience to the highest standard he knows, that man is building something that will last. Not because the world will recognize it. Maybe the world will not recognize it. But because it is real. Because it happened. Because the choices were made and the character was maintained and the life was lived with integrity in the only moments that actually exist, the ones you are in right now. That is the life Marcus Aurelius was constructing, entry by entry, in the pages no one was supposed to read. Not perfect. Not triumphant. Not without failure or grief or the accumulated weight of a life that demanded more than any man should have to carry. But genuine. Grounded in something that held. Built on the foundation that never shifts, not the empire, not the reputation, not the acclaim of history, but the daily honest work of becoming, as fully and as consistently as possible, the person he had decided to be. Be silent. Think deep. Win quietly. That is the Stoic edge. That is what this channel is for. If this video gave you something real, if any of these 8 principles landed somewhere that matters, then subscribe to the Stoic Edge right now. Hit the notification bell. Share this with one man in your life who needs it and will know what to do with it. Because the work is long and the work is worth it. And we are building something here, one video at a time, for the man who understands that the most important battle he will ever fight is the one happening inside him, and who has decided he is not going to lose it. We will see you in the next one.